Hello, I'm Tony Collins and this is the Rugby Reloaded podcast. Given the controversy about the upcoming England vs New Zealand Test match in Denver in June, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about how International Rugby League actually began over 100 years ago in 1907. To do that, we have to go back to the rugby revolution of the 1895 split. It may have initially been confined geographically to the north of England, but it unleashed forces that went right around the rugby world. In 1906, the tremors of the Northern Union Rebellion met the shockwaves caused by the 1905 All Blacks tour to Europe, and the subsequent turbulence led to an entirely unexpected consequence: the expansion of rugby league to Australia and New Zealand. The incredible success of the All Blacks, they lost just one of 35 matches, famously against Wales, scoring almost 1,000 points against just 59, disguised the fact that the tour brought to boiling point the pressures that had been building up in Southern Hemisphere rugby over the past decade. When the All Blacks arrived back home in Auckland in March 1906, it was announced that the tour had made a profit of almost £9,000. Yet the players, now lauded as national heroes of New Zealand, had received only 3 shillings per day expenses. A newspaper report by an original All Black explained their frustrations. That they, the All Blacks, could scarcely raise £10 in the whole team on their return passage home to New Zealand is well known, and the fact made a great impression in colonial circles. This brought the question before the colonial public, and it was generally admitted that the team were not well treated. Several were men of means and could well afford the loss of time, but the majority were working men. The months spent in Britain had also demonstrated to many of the All Blacks that working men rugby players did not simply have to grin and bear the situation. The All Blacks had seen at first hand that the Northern Union paid players and that it was possible for them to benefit from their rugby talent. What was more, the principles of the Northern Union game, even before its decisive rule changes in 1906, matched the open rugby philosophy of many players and officials in New Zealand. As in all revolutions, a catalyst was needed to light the tinder. According to a 1928 account, George Smith, the All Black winger and champion all-round athlete, met with Northern Union officials while on the 1905 tour. He also had the opportunity to study the Northern Union during his 1902 trip to Britain to compete in an international athletics meeting. Moreover, George Stephenson, an Otago theatre owner, had played for Manningham before and after the 1895 split, providing a direct link to the Northern Union. In 1904 he wrote, "New Zealand football is very similar to that of the north of England and resembles the present system of the professional game under the Northern Union." There's also evidence that George Smith stopped off in Sydney on his way back home from the All Blacks tour to discuss the state of rugby down under and the prospects for the Northern Union with his Australian rugby contacts. The All Blacks' return home in 1906 must have quickly been followed by discussions about switching to the Northern Union, because barely 12 months later, in March 1907, Canterbury postal clerk Albert Baskerville announced that a professional All Black side would tour England later that year to play Northern Union clubs. Baskerville was a well-known player in New Zealand, but was perhaps better recognised as the author of Modern Rugby Football, a book that promoted open rugby and decried the sport's unthinking belief in tradition. He was the public face of a grassroots movement of disgruntled New Zealand players. As soon as Baskerville made his announcement, he was declared persona non grata by the New Zealand Rugby Union and banned from setting foot on any rugby ground in New Zealand. The New Zealand Rugby Union then demanded that every player selected for that year's North Island vs South Island match sign a declaration that they were amateurs and that they would inform the New Zealand Rugby Union about any players who were planning to join Baskerville. In England, Cecil Ray Palliser, the equivalent of the New Zealand ambassador to the UK and the New Zealand Rugby Union's delegate to the RFU, called Baskerville's tour some kind of sensation to save the Northern Union, which he portrayed as under threat from the renewal of the spirit of real rugby. "It is a phantom side," he said, a description that was gleefully seized upon by Baskerville supporters. But despite this, the grievances of New Zealand rugby players ran deep, and local newspapers reported that Baskerville has met with even more success than he anticipated. Duncan McGregor, the railway worker who scored 4 tries for the All Blacks against England in 1905, was one of the first to refuse to sign the New Zealand Rugby Union's declaration. Of the 28 players who joined Baskerville, 9 were All Blacks, including 4 from the 1905 tour. 11 other players had played representative rugby. Yet it's important to remember that for those selected for the team, the only thing that they could be certain of was that they would never be allowed to play rugby union again. For these pioneers, it was truly a step into the unknown. The Phantom side arrived in Leeds on the evening of the 1st of October 1907 and were overwhelmed by the huge crowd that greeted them at Leeds railway station. Just like the celebrating crowds that welcomed home victorious cup-winning sides, the tourists found themselves at the centre of an outpouring of local pride and jubilation, as the Yorkshire Post reported. Bumper Wright, the New Zealand captain, called for 3 cheers for the people of Leeds, which were followed by a stirring Maori war cry and further cheering. The players were escorted to the Grand Central Hotel by the Hunslet Sharabang and the Northern Union officials in carriages, together with the still cheering crowd. The crush was so dense in Ball Lane and Briggate as to cause the stoppage of all traffic. After a few days acclimatising to their new sport, amazingly the New Zealanders had never seen, let alone played in a rugby league match, they took to the field and were unbeaten in their first 8 matches, before losing to Wigan in front of 30,000 spectators at Central Park. Initially, they used New Zealand Rugby Union wing-forward tactics and arranged their backs using 2-5-8s and 3-3-quarters, but found that the well-drilled Northern Union defences easily snuffed out the classic All Black tactics. Massa Johnson, who toured with both sides and later played for Wigan, said, "Charlie Mackerel, Duncan McGregor and myself had a good idea in 1905 what the Union players were like, but not for one moment did we think we would meet such continuous opposition as we did in 1907. Every match played in England was a test match, no place for weaklings or one who has a habit of looking for the easy or flash stuff on a football field." When the tourists arrived back 10 months later in June 1908, they had won the 3-match test series against the Northern Union representative side, been watched by over 300,000 people, and made a profit of more than £5,500, which the players shared amongst themselves. What's more, New Zealand Rugby Union had been thrown into turmoil as rugby league quickly grew in popularity. By 1914, Auckland had 39 rugby league teams, the same as the number of rugby union clubs, and Canterbury had 16, around about a third of the total of union clubs. The new game also quickly began to make headway amongst New Zealand Maori. In May 1908, even before Baskerville's tourists returned home, a Maori team led by the great three-quarter Opai Asher left to play a series of matches against Australian rugby league teams, the first tour based on the Maori community since the 1888 Native New Zealand tour to Britain. The New Zealand Rugby Union's response was predictable. In Taranaki, Wellington, South Canterbury, Otago, Southland and Auckland, dozens of players were expelled. But behind this blunderbuss approach, the New Zealand leadership of rugby union was divided. There was a significant body of opinion that felt that the New Zealand game was too much in thrall to the Rugby Football Union in England. The Canterbury and Otago rugby unions proposed reforming the rules of the game along the lines of the Northern Union, even suggesting that if the game did not change, the New Zealand Rugby Union should split from the RFU and form its own breakaway rugby union with Australia. But the outbreak of World War I meant that the hopes of the League pioneers were not completely fulfilled. League recruited strongly in the industrial working class areas of New Zealand, such as Auckland's docks and the West Coast mines, but rugby union commanded the schools, the professions and the majority of players. In many ways, rugby in New Zealand came to resemble that in England, where the two versions of the game occupied almost mutually exclusive social groups and cultural values. To be a league in New Zealand was, and is, to be an outsider, someone who was prepared to swim against the tide. Yet tragically, Albert Baskerville, the man who brought rugby league to New Zealand, did not live to see it established in his homeland. As his tourists arrived in Brisbane in May 1908 for the last leg of their arduous tour, he complained that he had developed a chill. Undeterred, he still planned to play in the scheduled match against Queensland. The day after the Queensland match, he was diagnosed with influenza. Within 3 days, he had developed pneumonia and was admitted into hospital. Late on the afternoon of Wednesday, 20th of May 1908, the team visited the hospital after defeating a Brisbane representative side 43-10. There they found Baskerville in a coma. At 6 o'clock, surrounded by the men whose lives he had transformed and who through him had themselves transformed rugby, Albert Henry Baskerville died. He was just 25 years old. Yet, in his short life, he has transformed the world of rugby forever. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Rugby Reloaded podcast. If you want to follow me on Twitter, My name is @CollinsTony, and if you want to dig a bit deeper into the history of rugby and the other football codes, take a look at my website at www.rugbyreloaded.com. Next week, we'll continue our focus on International Rugby League by looking at the spread of the game to France and the role of the great Frenchman Jean Gallier. Until then, thanks for listening.